The water was black, not blue, not grey, not the color you see in paintings or imagine when someone says river. It was black like oil, black like the spaces between stars, black like the inside of a coffin after they close the lid. I stood on the bank of the Rapido River in January 1944, and I could hear it moving, not rushing, moving, slithering, the sound a snake makes through wet grass. That's what I remember most about the moments before we crossed. Not the cold, though the cold was there. Not the German guns waiting for us on the other side, though they were there too. It was the sound of the water. Hungry water, patient water. We had been told this crossing would open the road to Rome. We had been told it was necessary. What we had not been told, what we would learn in the hours that followed, was that some of us would never leave that river. They would enter the darkness, and the darkness would keep them. Not buried, not shot, drowned, pulled under by the weight of their own equipment, while their mouths filled with January water so cold it stopped their hearts before their lungs gave out. I was there. I saw it happen, and 50 years later, I can still hear them. The men who died without screaming. The men who called for help and received none. The men who simply vanished beneath the surface and never came back up. War teaches you many things about death, but the Rapido River taught me something I had never learned before, that a man can die completely alone, surrounded by hundreds of his brothers, and not a single one of them can save him. This is the story of what happened at Sant'Angelo, Italy, on the night of January 20th, 1944. This is the story of the 36th Infantry Division, the Texas Division, the T-Patches, and the river that broke us. We knew it was wrong before we started. That's the thing about the Rapido that still keeps me awake. It wasn't a surprise. It wasn't bad luck or bad weather, or a plan that looked good on paper and fell apart in execution. Our commanding general, Fred Walker, told everyone who would listen that we were walking into a massacre. He protested to the Corps. He protested to the army. He wrote in his diary 2 days before the crossing, "I do not know of a single case in military history where an attempt to cross a river that is incorporated into the main line of resistance has succeeded. So I am prepared for defeat." He was a man who had defended the Marne River in 1918. He had watched Germans charge into his machine guns by the hundreds. He had seen what happens when men try to cross a fortified river against an enemy who is waiting for them. And now, 26 years later, he was being ordered to send his own men into the same slaughter from the other side. General Mark Clark wanted a diversion. The landings at Anzio were coming in 2 days, and Clark needed the Germans looking somewhere else, somewhere expendable. So he chose the Rapido River, and he chose us. When Walker suggested crossing north of Monte Cassino, where the defenses were weaker and the river fordable, Clark refused. He wanted the attack here, at the strongest point of the entire Gustav line. I remember standing in a farmhouse basement the night before, listening to the officers talk. Their voices were flat, the way men sound when they're discussing something already decided. Someone mentioned the boats, M2 assault boats, 410 pounds each, 13 feet long, too heavy to carry easily, too awkward to maneuver. We would have to haul them 2 miles across open ground because the mud was too deep for trucks. Someone else mentioned the mines. The Germans had seeded the approaches with everything they had. Our engineers had cleared lanes through the minefields and marked them with white tape, but everyone knew the tape would disappear in the dark. It would get trampled, torn, blown away by artillery. And then there was the river itself, 25 to 50 feet across, 9 to 12 feet deep, currently running at 8 miles per hour, strong enough to sweep a man off his feet even without 60 pounds of equipment strapped to his back. The banks were nearly vertical, 3 to 6 feet high. If you fell in, you weren't climbing out. The Germans had flooded the approaches. They had cut every tree for a mile inland, eliminating any cover. They had fortified the village of Sant'Angelo on the far bank and registered their artillery on every inch of ground we would have to cross. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division was waiting for us. Their commander considered them the finest combat organization in 14 MAV Panzer Corps. We knew all of this. Walker knew all of this. And still, at 19:30 hours on January 20th, we went. I watched the men of the 141st and 143rd Infantry Regiments form up in the darkness. They moved like men walking to the scaffold. No jokes, no bravado, just the sound of boots in mud and the distant rumble of our artillery trying to soften the German positions. It wouldn't work. We knew that too, but we went anyway, because orders are orders, because the army doesn't ask if you think a mission will succeed, because Mark Clark was in a warm headquarters 30 miles away, and we were in the mud, and the distance between those two places was measured in more than miles. The fog came down at nightfall like a curtain being drawn. Visibility dropped to 50 yards, then less. The men carrying the assault boats couldn't see the ground in front of them. They stumbled through knee-deep water in sunken trails, 6 inches of freezing mud pulling at their boots with every step. The boats were impossible, too heavy, too awkward, their canvas hulls catching on everything. Men fell, boats slipped from frozen fingers. In the darkness, entire squads lost their way. I was with a group of engineers trying to guide the 143rd Infantry to their crossing point south of Sant'Angelo. We had flashlights with red filters, but we couldn't use them. The Germans would see. So we moved by feel, by sound, by the desperate hope that we were going the right direction. The white tape marking the safe lanes through the minefields was already gone, trampled into the mud, invisible. A man stepped off the path somewhere ahead of me. I heard the click before I heard the explosion. The S-mine, what we called a bouncing Betty, jumped 3 feet in the air and detonated at waist height. Shrapnel tore through the darkness. Men screamed. Someone shouted for a medic, but the medics were scattered across a half-mile of black terrain, and no one could find anyone in that fog. We kept moving. We had no choice. The Germans knew we were coming. They had known for hours. Our artillery barrage had told them everything they needed to know, and now they were waiting. As we approached the river, mortar rounds began falling. Not aimed fire. They couldn't see us any better than we could see them, but they didn't need to aim. They had registered every approach, every likely crossing point. They simply fired at the coordinates and let the mathematics of war do the rest. I saw a boat take a direct hit while it was still being carried. The shell landed among the men, and the boat ceased to exist. Just gone. A flash of light. And then nothing where 6 soldiers had been. The men behind them didn't stop. They couldn't stop. They stepped over what remained and kept walking. By the time we reached the river, 25% of our boats were already destroyed, shot through by shrapnel, burned, abandoned in minefields where no one dared retrieve them. And the ones that remained, Lieutenant William Barker described it later, in a voice I still remember, hollow and disbelieving. The boats were riddled with bullet holes and shrapnel. When we got the boats in the water, they went straight down and sank, straight down, like stones. I need you to understand something about the Rapido River in January. The water temperature was near freezing. The current was fast enough to knock a strong man off his feet, and every soldier who stepped into that water was carrying a rifle, ammunition, grenades, a helmet, a pack, a canteen, an entrenching tool, 60 pounds of equipment designed to keep him alive in combat and absolutely guaranteed to kill him if he went underwater. The boats that didn't sink on contact began to swamp the moment they pushed off from the bank. 10 men would pile in with all their gear, and the boat would ride so low that water poured over the sides. They paddled desperately, fighting the current, but the current was faster than they were. It grabbed the boats and spun them. Paddles slapped uselessly at the black water. Men shouted instructions that no one could hear over the roar of the river and the crash of German artillery. And then the boats began to overturn. Lieutenant J.E. Phillips was on the bank. He couldn't see what was happening. No one could see anything in that darkness, but he could hear it. I could hear the paddles slapping water and hitting together, he said later, and the men yelled when their boat turned over. He paused when he told us this. The silence lasted a long time. It curdled your blood, he said finally, to hear those men drown. They couldn't swim, not with 60 pounds of equipment dragging them down, not in water so cold it paralyzed their muscles within seconds. They went under, and they stayed under, and there was nothing anyone could do. The men on the bank heard them calling for help. They heard the splashing stop. They heard the silence that came after. Sergeant Billy Kirby was in one of the boats that made it part-way across. Boats being hit all around me, he remembered, and guys falling out and swimming. I never knew whether they made it or not. He paused. I had never seen so many bodies of our own guys. Just about everybody was hit. I didn't have a single good friend who wasn't killed or wounded. The Germans had machine guns zeroed on the crossing points. When our men reached the far bank, the few who reached it, they found vertical walls of mud and no way to climb them. They clawed at the banks with their hands while bullets snapped overhead. Some made it up. Some slid back into the water and were carried away. Some were shot while they hung there, caught between the river and the shore, and their bodies dropped into the current and vanished downstream. Private First Class Bill Hartung crossed with his company that night. 200 men went into the water. There were bodies everywhere, he said afterward. Mostly parts, arms, legs. Some were decapitated. Bodies with hardly any clothes left on. He was 19 years old. By morning, only 27 of his company remained. I had turned into an old man overnight, he said. I know I was never the same person again. Those who made it across found themselves in hell. The far bank was a moonscape of shell craters and mud. The village of Sant'Angelo rose ahead, fortified and full of Germans who had been watching the crossing and waiting for exactly this moment. Our men dug in as best they could, scraping foxholes with their helmets because their entrenching tools had been lost in the river. They were cold, they were wet, their ammunition was soaked, their radios were dead, and they were alone. The engineers tried to build bridges. They had been ordered to construct footbridges across the Rapido so that reinforcements could pour across and exploit the breakthrough. But there was no breakthrough. There were only clusters of exhausted men on the wrong side of the river, surrounded by enemies, with no way to retreat and no help coming. The bridge attempts were suicidal. German artillery had every crossing point registered to the inch. The engineers would begin work, and the shells would fall, cables were cut, pontoons were sunk. Men were killed before they could drive a single stake. At one point, General Kendall found a group of engineers huddled in foxholes a mile and a half from the bridge site, refusing to move. Dug in and scared, he wrote in his report. He ordered them forward. They went. They didn't accomplish anything. They just died in a different place. By dawn on January 21st, the situation was clear. The crossing had failed. The men on the far bank were trapped. Small arms fire crackled constantly as the Germans probed our positions. Mortar rounds fell without pause. The wounded lay in shell craters filling with water, and the medics, those who had survived, had run out of everything. One officer remembered walking toward the river that morning. It didn't seem like what we were walking on was dirt and rocks, he said. We soon found out that it was dead GIs, stacked sometimes 6 feet high. They were from the crossing the night before. 6 feet high. I want you to understand that. The bodies of American soldiers piled so deep that other soldiers walked on them because there was no other path to the water. General Walker wanted to pull back. He knew the bridgehead was lost. He knew that every man sent across was a man thrown away. But General Keyes, his corps commander, ordered him to attack again. And so, at 1400 on January 21st, the 143rd Infantry went back into the river, the same approaches, the same Germans waiting with the same guns. The result was the same. I remember the silence most clearly, not the explosions. There were too many of those to remember individually. Not the screaming blurred together into a single sound, like wind, but the silence. The moment when the silence came. It was evening on January 22nd. The men who had made it across were still there, still fighting, still dying in their flooded foxholes. We could hear their weapons from our side of the river. M1 rifles, bars, the occasional chatter of a machine gun, the sounds of Americans killing Germans and Germans killing Americans, echoing across the black water. And then, sometime between 6 and 7 o'clock, the sounds of American weapons died. Not faded, died. One moment they were there, and the next moment they were gone. The German guns kept firing for a while. They were thorough, the Germans. But soon even those fell silent. And in that silence, we understood what had happened. The men on the far bank were gone. Dead, captured, drowned trying to swim back. It didn't matter which, they were gone. Walker wrote in his diary that night, January 22nd will long stand out in my memory as definitely December 25th or July 4th. Yesterday, 2 regiments of this division were wrecked on the west bank of the Rapido. Wrecked, that was the word he used. Not defeated, not repulsed. Wrecked, like ships on rocks. Like something that could never be made whole again. The casualty figures came later. 1,681 men, 143 killed outright, 663 wounded, 875 missing, which meant drowned, or captured, or blown into pieces too small to identify. The Germans lost 64 dead and 179 wounded. They called it a victory. We called it a disaster. Mark Clark came to visit the division on January 23rd. He stood among the survivors, the hollow-eyed men who had watched their friends disappear into black water, and he admitted some fault. It was as much my fault as anyone's, he said, because I knew how difficult the operation would be. He knew, and he sent us anyway. In 1946, the survivors of the 36th Division petitioned Congress to investigate. They called the Rapido crossing one of the most colossal blunders of the Second World War. They called it a murderous blunder that every man connected with this undertaking knew was doomed to failure before it took place. They asked Congress to take steps to prevent future soldiers from being sacrificed wastefully and uselessly. The investigation concluded that General Clark had exercised sound judgment. No action was taken. Clark was never held accountable. He went on to command all Allied forces in Italy. He retired a hero. The men who drowned in the Rapido are still there, some of them. Their bodies were never recovered. The river took them, and the river kept them. And somewhere in the mud beneath Sant'Angelo, they remain. There's one more thing I need to tell you. One more piece of this story that I have carried for 50 years. General Walker, the man who protested, the man who wrote in his diary that he was prepared for defeat, the man who knew exactly what would happen and tried to stop it, was quietly relieved of command 6 months later. They sent him to Fort Benning to run the infantry school. It was a prestigious assignment. It was also a message. You were right, but you were too loud about being right, and we cannot have that. The 36th Division never fully recovered. Oh, they rebuilt the ranks. They received replacements. They went on to fight through France and Germany. But the men who had been there, the men who survived the Rapido, were different now. They had learned something that cannot be unlearned. They had learned that their lives could be spent like coins on a whim by men who would never face consequences for the spending. I think about Lieutenant Karl Strom sometimes. He went ahead of his men to find their launching site. When he looked back, 2 explosions erased his entire platoon. Not a single man left standing. He crossed anyway. I don't know what happened to him after that. The records don't say. I think about Lieutenant Barker, who crawled into a minefield to rescue a wounded soldier, and then watched his boat sink the moment they touched the water. "There were a lot of men in the water," he said. "We lost a lot of good men." Simple words, unbearable weight. I think about the medics who ran out of supplies, and the wounded who called for help that never came. I think about the men who drowned alone, pulled under by their own equipment, surrounded by friends who could hear them dying and could do nothing to save them. And I think about Mark Clark in his headquarters, warm and dry, writing in his diary that he knew the attack would be costly, but he was impelled to go ahead because some blood had to be spilled. Some blood had to be spilled. He was right about that, at least. Blood was spilled, rivers of it, enough to turn the Rapido red in the morning light, they said, enough to fill the dreams of every man who survived for the rest of his life. The 36th Division Veterans Association had a saying after the war: if you weren't wounded, captured, or killed, you weren't at Rapido. They meant it as a grim joke, but it wasn't really a joke. It was the truth. Everyone who crossed that river paid a price. Some paid with their lives, some paid with their bodies, and some paid with something harder to see but just as real, a piece of themselves that went into the black water and never came out. I was there. I remember it. The sound, the silence, the smell. War doesn't end. It only fades until someone else finds it again. Until then, I'll keep telling you what I saw. When the dark returns. When the war returns. After dark.